So welcome once more. This is our program of the afternoon. The event has two parts, and in the first part we'll have a couple of presentations. We'll have a pretty tight lineup of presentations of about 10 minutes each. After that, there will be a bit of time for questions that are related to the presentations. And in the second part, we'll have a more interactive part with live polling and feedback from the audience. Unfortunately, our first speaker, Ludek Matiszka, is not available. He's ill today, so he can't join us. But our second speaker, Valentino Cavalli, kindly agreed to include a few words on the background of the EOSC ambitions, so that this part is covered in his presentation. So that will be our first speaker of today, Valentino Cavalli. He's the Strategy and Innovation Officer of EGI, and he will be reflecting on the maturity and readiness on the basis of, of a landscape analysis. Are you ready, Valentino?
Yes, okay. I am.
I'll stop sharing and then you can pull your presentation up.
Okay, good. So good afternoon, everyone. I assume that you see me and you hear me well, and I'm now going to share my screen and my presentation and then start it. So can people see my presentation okay? Yes, right. So some reflections on EOSC maturity and readiness based on the landscape analysis which we carried out in the EOSC Synergy project, and to give you a bit of background on the EOSC Synergy project, it's a regional project. So one of the projects which were funded a couple of years ago by the European Union to help the deployment of the EOSC beyond the common core development, particularly inside the European countries. It's a regional project, but it's not really covering a region in the sense we are, normally used to. A few of the essential aspects of this project are, so as I said, helping the implementation and the adoption of the EOSC, in particular, looking at infrastructure managers and scientific application for the core interoperability guidelines. The approach is twofold. One is to focus on quality software. Another one is to providing an environment where thematic services become integrated in part in the EOSC, in more generally the EOSC ecosystem. There is also a component on policies, which is the one I myself am involved in, and on which I will tell you a bit more in particular, which is has the goal of looking at ways of harmonizing policies in relation to the EOSC across countries. And it does this by means of a landscape analysis and an analysis of the gaps in the policies that exist between those countries, and according to a number of indicators which we grouped across several dimensions. We have a public deliverable which was issued just before the summer, and there you can find the reference to that deliverable. So let me start with the landscaping activity. So what we did in the EOSC Synergy project was to look at 7 countries which are part of the project. And these are the Czech Republic, Spain, the Netherlands, Poland, Portugal, Slovakia, and the UK. So you can already see that that it's not really a very homogeneous region that we're talking about. And I'll say a few words about that also in the following of this presentation. But this landscape work is part of a broader context. So starting from the EOSC Secretariat and those other groups that are part of the a wider EOSC governance structure. There were similar landscaping initiatives when this project started a couple of years ago, and they all produced comparable results. So there is, just to mention one, you see there a picture of a page which is available on the EOSC Secretariat portal, which links to broader landscape analysis from the what was used to be called the landscape working group. These, let's not forget that these are kind of snapshots which need sort of reflect the situation at the particular moment in time. And actually what we're going to see today is kind of, you know, an updated version of what was produced a year ago. The other thing I wanted to mention, because this is also a reflection, a way of reflecting on maturity or readiness, different ways of, you know, talking about this. There are some ongoing activities about the EOSC readiness, a couple of reports which were produced also by a group of these various regional projects, which I listed on the previous page. And then based on the result of that, a small project to test a proof of concept for a readiness dashboard. So basically a tool to be able to visualize the results of this readiness work. This is far from being complete, and there is still a very, very, I would say, it's multi-stakeholder complex discussion going on about this readiness, but it's being more and more taken up by what is now the official governance body of the EOSC, so the EOSC Association, and by the flagship project, which is developing stuff in relation to the EOSC now, which is EOSC Future. So these things are taken up. What we have done, I've contributed to sort of, you know, the kind of discussion and preparation work. Now, our landscape analysis, I think I have to run a bit more quickly. But here you see what were the topics of our landscape analysis. I think the important thing is to sort of the middle bullet, but basically we wanted to look at the policies, looking at generic services for data production, data processing and preservation, and also the thematic resources and the services that target the need of the specific communities. And the other thing was to identify the gaps that are visible or perceived across the various countries and through a number of indicators in 5 areas: open science strategies, PIDs, funding, access provisioning, and awareness and maturity, with the overall goal to, as I said before, to try and find ways of bridging those gaps and try to provide recommendations for harmonizing policies across countries, and in order to facilitate the take-up and the deployment of the EOSC. This slide is just a way of showing that the 7 countries that we have targeted are far from homogeneous. So you see in terms of population, GDP, research funding as GDP percentage, they are not really comparable. And that's also the reason why we decided not to have a single landscape report, but to issue individual country reports. And I put this slide here for reference. They're all available through the EOSCsynergy.eu project website, but also each of them stored in an official project repository, sometimes the central one, sometimes at locally, like the Dutch one, I think is sitting at DANS. Yeah, this is not very recent, because these reports date back to May 2020, so they are already more than a year old. What we also did in order to promote this more widely, we created a number of info sheets. You see there an example. So with providing some highlights from the countries, a kind of roadmap related to open science. And in the bottom, some indicators, a selection of indicators about awareness and EOSC maturity. Now, what I'm going to show you in the next couple of minutes are some highlights of the more recent gap analysis that we have carried out. So you see here the columns, the 7 countries that we've taken up into account, and on the lines, some of the indicators. And then the color codes go from the sort of lighter to the darker, so from very low up to very high. I have to say that these are kind of a subjective perception of the values, needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. But I think what is interesting to see here is that the level of awareness amongst decision makers in the countries that we're talking about is sometimes higher, and then we see a trend, than the awareness of the EOSC in practice by researchers. So if you compare the first and the second line, you will see that, you know, it's darker, and therefore, you know, there's more awareness in that area. Decision makers seem to be well aware of the EOSC, something that, you know, there have been national policies around the European Commission pushing for this at very high level for a long time. The researchers certainly know about it, but they know very little what it actually is. I think another interesting item to look at is the third line, where if you ask researchers if they are aware of the facilities that they have available in their country, like, you know, infrastructure, repositories, and all that, they seem to be well aware. But when then you, but making the link between these existing facilities and the EOSC is more difficult for them. So there is a recommendation, which I will show in a moment, about trying to address this point. A few other things are here, which I think is interesting to see, is that in some countries, take the Czech Republic, things are starting right now. Until now, there wasn't really much going on. So in terms, for instance, of national incentives to align with the EOSC, there was nothing at the moment, but there are plans that, you know, might take up very quickly, also because of the changes that I mentioned with the EOSC association having taken place.
Sorry to interrupt, Valentina. You have maybe 2 minutes left. So
yeah, that's good, because these are the last 2 slides.
Yes, yeah. Thank you.
So in terms of maturity and readiness, also I'd like to highlight just a few indicators here. So again, take the second line, which shows the involvement of the government level and degree of involvement of support for the EOSC in the country at government level. And you see quite high scores. But then if you look at what level of effectiveness, what level of effectiveness are national policies for the EOSC implemented, that's very low in the whole region. And there are a few things, I mean, that's the EOSC, but it's only one aspect of the broader open science agenda, right? So for instance, if you talk about open science and data in general, then there is a bit more awareness. And if you talk about open access, then the awareness is even higher. That shows also that there is, I mean, things don't mature all of a sudden, and that's normal. I mean, you know, the things that started earlier, like open access movement, are more mature everywhere in Europe than other things like the EOSC, which is particularly a new thing. I think this is my last slide. I wanted to only highlight some of the recommendations that came up of our study, particularly those I feel are more relevant for research institutions at the national level. So one, as I mentioned before, is to try and focus on the practical aspects of the EOSC and the rule of participation, and explain that the EOSC builds on existing facilities. So it's not something that's completely new, but that link still has to be made at various levels. And also, it's important to build on success stories There are a few success stories, and we all know how the COVID-19 collaboration has really benefited from open science, and so that's a good thing to build on. Promote the recognition evaluation of data sharing and RDM, and ensure that there are consistent and coordinated activities in place to leverage best practice in this area. There are a number of excellence centers in the Netherlands, for instance, but also in other countries, but these need to be widened. And another point which I think sometimes people are affected is the perception that this EOSC thing is all very complex. And so I think like an event like this one today, trying to shed some light on that complexity. And this is really all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valentino. I think in the interest of time, we quickly move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Peter Doorn. He's a senior researcher and scientific advisor at DANS, and he will be presenting an update of the situation with respect to open science and open data in the Netherlands. Are you ready, Peter, to share your screen? Yes.
I'm trying to do that now, as you can probably see. And if people can hear me and can see my screen, that means that it works.
Yeah.
So indeed, I would like to present some practical things concerning the figures behind open science in the Netherlands. And that is in a way also an update of what we presented last year. A couple of the people present may have attended last year's meeting during the at the occasion of the EGI conference. Because if we're talking about open science, we also would like to measure in some way what it is about. And if we're talking about gaps on our way to open science, or in a concrete organizational form on our way to the European Open Science Cloud, we need to have some figures. This is also a point that is that people are well aware of at the European level, and there are proposals to measure the progress towards open science along a couple of dimensions. And this is what I present here on this slide is the proposal by the task force, the landscaping task force of the EOSC. And as you can perhaps see from this table, they recognize 5 dimensions. And by the way, the projects, including EOSC Synergy, that Valentino mentioned before me, have all contributed to this list, but it also meant that it became a very long list. There are, in this overview, some 16 main indicators and some 29 sub-indicators, and then there is a couple of additional indicators that were suggested by the audience in different sessions. And the present situation is that there is a total of about 43 indicators. And there is also a proof of concept for a tool to visualize them and to present them. But the problem is that very few metrics appear to be available really at the European level. And also at the national level, metrics vary a lot and appear to be hard to compare. If you want to compare the metrics from one country to the other one, that is hard. Now, DANS is also working on this in the context of EOSC Synergy, but also in other contexts. And we also are trying to present a monitor or a dashboard on open science. We based ourselves on the indicators selected in the EOSC Synergy project, but we focus here on quantitative metrics and not so much on narratives. What you often see is that when it is difficult to measure something, then we resort to a qualitative statement about the situation. But we try to focus here on quantitative things. Also, we restrict ourselves a little bit to the DANS mission. That means that we are more restricted to data services rather than to infrastructure in a broad sense. And we focus on deeds and not on words. So if we are talking about policies, we don't try to measure so much what the policies say, but what the policies actually result in. Currently, our way of working is still largely collecting the data manually and presenting them annually. So you get an update of the situation of last year today, of how it looks now. And we focus on metrics that are available. And this also means that we are more limited. So not 43, but just 10. You see a list of the 10 metrics that we collected information about here. But for the sake of this presentation, the whole presentation will be available after this workshop. And you will find also number 7, 8, and 9 there. But here I will focus just on the black ones, so 1 to 6 and number 10. But first of all, it is important to know what we're talking about sources and definitions. So if we're talking about digital research infrastructure, different registers and overviews define it differently. NWO, which is at the bottom of this screen, updated this year the 2018 list of large-scale scientific infrastructures, also called facilities. And many of them qualify as equipment rather than as data facilities. That is indicated by the orange and the blue parts of the bar. Re3 data is another source that is actually an international registry of repositories, which include information systems and data banks of various nature. So you see already quite different effects there. And also if you compare 2021 to 2020, you see that those also differ, but of course less. The changes are not revolutionary, but rather evolutionary. Well, likewise, Merrill and ESFRI also provide overviews of research infrastructures. And finally, the Landelijk Coördinatiepunt Research Data Management Facilities also provides information and updated this last year. So in conclusion, the figures presented depend on what is measured by such registries and how. And keep in mind that registrations are seldom complete and get quickly outdated. Still, we can safely assume that the Dutch data infrastructure or information infrastructure consists of certainly around 100 components or perhaps more of substance and recognition. Perhaps I should also go very quickly through this slide, which attempts to give an image of the distribution over disciplines of the different types of facilities. And as measured by NWO, those are the first two, situation 2018 and situation 2021. Re3 data, which doesn't display much change, also because the registration isn't updated that frequently. And Merrill doesn't have an update because it's no longer continued. An interesting thing is whether repositories are certified. And here we see an interesting trend, even over just 1 year, that in 2020, 16 out of 56 data repositories as measured in Re3 data in the Netherlands complied with some certificate for trustworthy long-term preservation. In 2021, the numbers increased to 18 out of 62. So the total number of certificates also grew from 20 to 22, and 4 repositories have more than 1 certificate. And we can also see that the data seal of approval is gradually superseded by the core trust seal. 17 repositories comply with data seal of approval or core trust seal in 2021. And in 2020, this was just 15. And these seals make sure that data is preserved and shared in a fair way. The use of persistent identifiers in data repositories. An important element of FAIR data. In 2020, 54% of the Dutch data repositories supplied PIDs, mostly the handle or the DOI, and sometimes a URN. Over the past year, the numbers improved. Now 63 was for 54% supplies a PID, and especially the share of the DOI grew while handle remained stable.
Peter, sorry to interrupt. You have about 2 minutes left.
Yeah, I have about 3 slides and a concluding one. Numbers of data sets in repositories. I have 2 slides on this, and perhaps the most important thing to say here is that no complete overview of the research data in all Dutch repositories exist, let alone of data that are not stored in any repository. The type of data units, files, sets, collections vary over and also within repositories. One data set may consist of just one file or of thousands of files. One file may be a small table or may consist of millions of records. Such differences are partially dependent upon the discipline or community. For instance, the language archive of the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics registers individual language files, but also bundles that are parts of projects, archives, or collections. And the way they register that has a huge effect on the size of the archive as you measure it. Narcis aggregates the information on research data sets stored in 23 repositories. The total number of data sets in these repositories grew from about 290,000 to over 330,000 in the past year, an increase of almost 13%. And 55% of these data sets are stored at DANS. In 2020, this was 50%. Another way to look at this is just to look at the university repositories. So that's the second look. 9 universities use Dataverse NL, which is hosted by DANS, and the 3 technical universities in Wageningen use 40U Research Data, a Figshare implementation. 2 more universities also use Figshare. Nijmegen uses a homegrown repository system, and Utrecht uses Yoda next to Dataverse. Several universities use more than one repository next to their publication repositories, which sometimes also hold data, by the way. As yet, the total contents of these data repositories is modest, about 10,000 datasets in 2020 and almost 13,000 now, which is still a considerable increase of 25% in 1 year, which demonstrates the potential. Finally, another.
Sorry,
this is the last.
Please.
Well, if you want, I will skip that one because this is another subject which is about open publications, and the trend is, I think, visible.
Yeah, I think in the interest of time, it would be best to wrap up.
That gives the overview of what has changed over the past year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, and I'm sorry that I had to interrupt you.
No, that's fine.
I think it would be good if we move on to the next presentation, and after the whole lineup of presentations, we'll have time for questions. So we'll now move on to our next speaker, Maurice Bauhaus from SURF. He's working on open science research and ICT there, and he will give a presentation on the national program Open Science and the collaboration between SURF and DANS. Are you ready, Maurice? We see.
Yeah, but it's but it's always difficult. It's always difficult to find the mute button when you're sharing. So should have done it the other way around. Let's see. If everything is correct, you can both hear me and see the slides. And I can't see you, so silence.
Perfect, Maurice.
Silence means that it works. Thank you for the invitation. Today, the topic will basically be the Dutch data landscape and the things that are inhabiting that landscape. Now, 10 minutes is an extremely short amount of time to talk about all of these aspects. So I've taken out 3 aspects that I think are peculiar for the Netherlands situation and might be informative to both our international and Dutch colleagues. The first one will be the NPOS, the National Plan, Platform or Program for Open Science, then the Digital Data Competence Centers and the collaboration between DANS and SURF. First of all, NPOS, the National Platform for Open Science. It started out as a plan back in 2016 with the Amsterdam Call for Action. The Dutch, with all stakeholders present, sat together and formulated a national plan Open Science, which transformed into the National Platform Open Science, which first phase is now ending. And I think the slide that Peter just didn't show showed one of the successes, the very large amount of open access publishing that's been achieved as part of that plan. From the top of my head, more than 85%. Now, a platform and a plan are nice, but you always need the next one. So phase 2 is being started at the moment. And what that will do, it will build a multi-annual plan 2030 that gives you the scope for open science in the Netherlands. And basically 3 large topics are going to be addressed: fair data, open access, and citizen science. Well, with the contents of this particular workshop, I'll focus on the fair data table. On the fair data tables are a selection of Dutch stakeholders in the Dutch landscape. So there are people from NPOS, from the Technical Universities Center for Data Research, you just saw them come by, from DANS, from SURF, from GoFair as the international certification agency, the Dutch ERICS, the Digital Competence Center, and a number of institutes. They're around the table and they will work on what do we want to achieve in 2013. And it actually needs all of these stakeholders. Here in the blue circle, you see the large data tables. And basically, there are 4 key objectives for this. First of all, build capacity for data stewardship. Make sure that we get enough data stewards, that they know what they're doing, that they're trained, that the researchers are aware that they exist and that they can collaborate with them. So this is a professionalization and training program. Secondly, make sure that data is machine actionable, or that there is metadata associated to that. And you can't do that in a general way. We all know that. That is in part domain specific. But we need to make sure that we have the underlying services knowledge available. That's the purple one at the top. If you go to the, and I'm wondering if you see my cursor, if you go to the right, you need a trust framework, a set of rules, regulations, rules for participation, in such a way that we can deal with all of this data. Have general rules on how sensitive data, or personalized or private data are handled. And we make sure that if these rules are set, that they are as open as possible and as close as necessary. And finally, the last subtable is make sustainable interoperable network of fair data services and research infrastructures. Make sure that we have cooperating and interoperating services on top of all of that can deal with all of this data, that make these data searchable, and make sure that we have all of that available. Now, this plan is being written, and I would love to have shown you now the big roadmaps for all of these 4 subtables, but it's being discussed right now. And somewhere in the next few months, a large round of public discourse or public comments are going to be solicited on the plan that will be published by MPOS. That plan will also be the basis for funding from the national government. One of their goals is to get fair data or get open science at a higher level in 2030, and they understand that that also means investment. This plan will give the basis for that investment. And what you see is in the Netherlands, there isn't another open science program. So all stakeholders, from funders to universities to the data infrastructures themselves, are around these tables. And we are sure that we have common goals set. Then something peculiarly Dutch, Digital Competence Center. Data is not just for researchers. It's also not a pure ICT problem. It's also not a library problem. But in many institutes, that's how it's handled. It's either an emphasis on storage or on the content of the data or on the metadata or on the long-term preservability of that data. Now, to make sure that these different parties at the institutes collaborate, NWO, our local funder, has issued a call encouraging institutes, universities, and other research institutes to organize local DCCs, local digital competence center. And usually that's a combination of the IT department, the library department, and the academic research department. And I really like the way that the University of Delft says it on their website. The DCC is an on-campus initiative set up to help researchers to develop competencies needed to do fair research and provide hands-on support for implementing data management workflows and developing research software. Now, the nice thing there is that many institutes are implementing this. NWO also said something else. Yeah, it's very nice to have these digital competence center at the institutes, but that's not the only way the world is organized. Research is organized through research domains or through large-scale infrastructures. So to foster that, they've set up a call to actually institute thematic DCCs. And the guiding principle are the scientific domains in which these digital competence centers work. That call is going to be set up in 2022, and pathfinders, 3 domains, 2 pathfinders each, have been appointed. DANS is delivering the one for social sciences and humanities, are appointed for the major domains, social sciences and humanities, life science and health, and exact sciences and engineering. And for those who like pictures, like myself, it should roughly work like this. You have the institutes, which are the verticals, which each have a local digital competence center. You have the horizontals, which are the scientific domains, which each have a thematic digital competence center. And all of these parties that are circling around these, like SURF and DANS, the Dutch e-Science Center, the Landelijk Coördinatiepunt Research Data Management, GoFair, and many, many others, will interface either with the local and or with the thematic to either provide services or knowledge, organize this, all of this to make life easier for the researcher.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Maurice, but I would like to ask you to wrap up.
That's fine. This is my last slide.
Yeah, okay, great.
So finally, something for the Netherlands are DANS and SURF. Both working and providing services for a long time in the Netherlands. DANS aimed at data, SURF aimed at infrastructure and knowledge. And we've done the exercise. Where do we overlap? And I will not go into the picture, which goes from active research on the left side to the reusability of data. But we've mapped out a path in which we can operate together. In this, to make sure that there's a clear pathway for researchers to use either the DANS services or the SURF services, but make a clear choice. And if someone outgrows the SURF services or the DANS services, be able to use the other ones. And this goes from the data sharing part in the active research area to the long-term preservation part in the data repository. And what the final thing that we will do, we will also promote each other's services. Well, this is the first nucleus. There are many in the Dutch data landscape, and we, over the coming few years, will be looking to combine these kinds of collaborations and make them larger. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maurice. We'll quickly move on to our last speaker. That's Leynard. She's a research data management specialist at DANS, and she will be presenting on the work of the task force upskilling countries to engage in EOSC. Okay, thank you.
Now, this is always a bit difficult to come as a last speaker, and also, because you always think about links to your own presentation when you listen to the others, and you tend to maybe change your own. So I try not to do that because it usually gets a bit chaotic then. Anyway, I want to update you on the recent initiative by the EOSC Association. You've heard about the EOSC Association probably, and also Valentino mentioned it. But since the spring, we are working, they have initialized advisory groups and task forces. And I would like to move to the next slide. Does it work here? Now it does. So what are these task forces? These are association members that can join the task force and help to steer the implementation of EOSC. I think that's the most important point. And also liaise with all these EOSC projects that are going on, among others, of course, EOSC Future that was mentioned, but also look at the strategic research and innovation agenda for the EOSC, and see how things can be improved. The task force advisory groups and topics are mentioned here. So we have 5 advisory groups, and each group has a couple of task forces. And I will be moving on and talk about upskilling countries to engage in EOSC, which is one of the task forces in the research careers and curricula. So all of these task forces have published their draft charters, and the link is in the slides, but you can also, if you Google on it, you can find it quite easily. So the first draft was created by coordinators. That was in May, and then April, May. Then volunteers could comment on these drafts, and the final version were submitted at the EOSC Symposium. So maybe you have heard of them also through that channel. So each task force has a specific draft, and this one on upskilling countries was created by the people that were mentioned here. To mention a bit more about the upskilling countries to engage in EOSC task force, the reason that we included this presentation in this workshop, because although the topic is a bit slightly different, it's about open science education and not so much about data infrastructure, but it also, of course, links to all the topics that were shared, as sharing data is one of the requirements of open science, of course, and also open and fair software and open and fair documents. Anyway, the aim of this particular task force will be to create, we have looked at EOSC synergy, and we also look at the experiences that you have with the comparative analysis based on a, let's say, scoping instrument, mentioned a couple of indicators, but what we really would like, what the ultimate goal is, that we have a better overview of the open science education at a member state level of all countries, and see what are the typical pathways that countries have taken, if we can describe them, and if countries can be inspired by those pathways. So we are thinking about open science education here only. So it's very difficult to narrow it down all the time. So that's why I'm saying. And also support the dialogue of stakeholders involved in open science education developments, policy making and upskilling models. So the duration of the task force is 24 months, so 2 years. The current number of members is 26. I will say a bit more about that in a sec. Yeah, when I mention open science, this is what it means: sharing documents, data, and software. When this task force is talking about open science, I think that should be clarified. The core activities, I will not extend on this too much because we are already over time, but we have created 3 phases. The first phase of 6 months, looking at the national situations, taking every previous work regarding open science education into account, looking in liaise with stakeholders, for example, the university associations. We think that that is also very relevant. And then look at the paths for success regarding open science education, and whether or not it can be a framework with certain metrics or more of a qualitative approach. I don't know yet. We will see. Peter. Now the second phase.
Sorry to interrupt, Ellen. Could you wrap up in a minute or two?
Yeah, I will. So the second phase is what are the similarities and differences? Can we focus on them? Can we take a couple of countries and map what we found to these countries and mention, for example, next steps for other countries that didn't choose that path yet. Then the last is a year. And that's more about thinking if the framework can be mapped to all countries and promote and support the steps that we can see that other countries can take, and support also the communication between country champions and others that would like to follow those. What happens next? Last week, the EOSC Association has informed the members of these task forces that they have now been selected as members. So the first period, it was only drafting of the charter, and now the task force will start in October, and the beginning of the activities that will last for all the task forces for around 1 to 2 years till September. That's it from my side.
Thank you very much, Ellen. That was a nice wrap up and timely. So I see that we got a question in the chat from Garrett, but already Peter responded to that, and I see that Garrett responded to Peter. So I was just wondering if there's anything that you would like to add to that discussion at this point.
If Gareth wants to start.
Yeah, apologies for the background noise here. I'm just outside of Vienna. Yeah, it was just about how to align. Well, it was twofold, Peter. It was how to align on the activities that are happening across the spectrum now, right? So at national level, in the EOSC Association, and then also at organizational level, plus across different groups. As you know, different people are working on this. and then also what data that we will use, where will we get, which repositories will we be using, and how do we trust the data? Who validates the data ultimately? So there's a lot of open questions here that need to be addressed.
Yeah, and of course I don't have an answer that really covers everything immediately. Probably the short version is that it will probably need to grow, but I think it will be. In general, it is important not to be over ambitious, because if there are too many indicators and with all kinds of information that is very difficult to collect, it will be much harder to get successes than to start with a modest set. And obviously the countries need to adapt more or less to what the needs of the EOSC are, and the EOSC will have to adapt to what is available in the countries. So somewhere the middle ground will probably provide the best way forward.
Yeah, and there's overlap, of course, as well in the data collection and in the data reporting, which will happen at many different levels in terms of EOSC readiness, in terms of the contributions from members of the association and member states towards the partnership, so that they will also have to be, deselected and separated at some point in the collective.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. If that sort of answers your question, then I would like to move on to another question that was posed in the chat by Daniel Stoon. This was a question to Maurice. Daniel, do you want to pose the question yourself, or shall I read it out?
Well, I can do it also.
Or you can answer it.
The question to me was, do you know how much NWO will spend on thematic digital competence centers? And while I saw the question, I was trying to look it up in the original report. It's not a huge amount of money. It's a few million. Maybe one of the others knows the exact amount, over a period of 3 years. So it is enough money to set something up. It's not money to set something up and to make sure that the coordination is there. It's not enough to actually set up an infrastructure or set up services and that kind of money. Now, there might be a solution there, but I'm not prepared to go into that one yet.
Thank you very much, Maurice. I think that sort of gives a good indication of the amounts that will be available. Are there any other questions? I don't see any other questions in the chat. So if there are no urgent questions now, then I think we should move on to the second part of this event. Peter, are you ready to share? Then I'll stop the recording now and we'll move on to the second part.